All right, strap in everyone, because today we are taking a deep dive into human development.
Oh, I love this topic.
You know how we go from these helpless little babies to, well, us?
Right, like walking, talking, with hopes and dreams and anxieties and all that.
It's kind of mind-blowing when you actually stop and think about it, right?
It really is.
So we're going to be cracking open chapter 1 of this human development textbook to try to unpack some of this.
Sounds good.
So to kick things off, what exactly is human development? I mean, it's got to be more than just watching kids grow up, right?
Oh, absolutely. We're talking about change and stability, but get this, across the entire lifespan.
Oh, wow. So from the moment we're born to our golden years?
Yeah, and it's actually science.
Mhm.
There are researchers out there who are constantly studying this.
So it's not just grandma's armchair observations.
No, not at all. This is a legit field of study.
So what are these scientists looking at? Are they just focusing on the good changes?
Actually, no. They study all kinds of changes, both positive and negative, kind of like trying to understand the whole picture of how we become who we are.
It's like solving this giant puzzle about human beings.
Exactly.
So they're trying to figure out not just what happens, but also why it happens.
Right, and the really cool part is that ultimately they want to use this knowledge to predict and maybe even influence how we develop.
That's pretty powerful. So helping people reach their full potential or maybe overcoming some challenges.
Exactly.
I like that. So the book talks about these 3 main areas, like lenses through which researchers look at this whole process: physical, cognitive, and psychosocial. Physical development, that one's pretty straightforward, right? Our bodies change.
Right, but it's more than just getting taller.
Yeah, but what about these other 2, cognitive and psychosocial? Those are
Yeah.
a little bit more abstract.
Well, picture like a 3-legged stool. If one leg is messed up, the whole thing is going to be wobbly. These 3 areas are like the legs of the stool. They all support each other. So you've got your physical growth, but you've also got things like how our brains develop and how we learn and think.
Ah, so that would be the cognitive part.
Right. And then there's the psychosocial, which that's all about our emotions, our relationships, our personality, basically the things that make us, well, us.
Like why some people are shy and others are outgoing.
Exactly. Or how our relationships with our parents, early on can influence our relationships later in life.
It's all connected, isn't it?
It really is. And these 3 areas, they're not like separate boxes. They're constantly interacting and influencing each other.
That makes sense. So it's like development is multifaceted.
It is, very much so.
Yeah.
And it's constantly changing.
So think about a teenager going through puberty. Their bodies are changing like crazy, but that also affects how they feel about themselves and how they learn, right?
Exactly. It's all intertwined.
Okay, so that's how we kind of categorize what development is. But life isn't just this smooth, continuous process. There are phases, right? Like childhood, adolescence, adulthood. These periods or stages, do they really exist?
Well, it's interesting. The book says that those categories, they're more like social constructs than hard and fast biological realities.
So it's not like there's a switch that flips on your 18th birthday and suddenly you're an adult.
Not really, no. And even the idea of childhood has changed a lot throughout history and across cultures.
Okay, so those labels are useful, but we shouldn't take them too literally. So then what's the point of even thinking about these periods of development if they're not set in stone?
Well, they give us a framework for understanding the typical challenges and milestones that people tend to face at different points in their lives.
So a toddler learning to walk versus a teenager figuring out their identity. Those are totally different challenges.
Exactly. And it helps researchers study how people develop across the lifespan, even if the specific timing and experience of those periods can vary a lot from person to person.
So while there are some common themes, everyone's journey is unique.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that individual differences are huge.
I like that it's we're all on the same road trip, but we're driving different cars and taking different detours.
And we might even stop at different rest stops.
Exactly. Okay, so we've got these phases, but what really drives development? Why are some kids super outgoing while others are more reserved?
Well, that's where we get into the classic nature versus nurture debate.
Ah, so is it our genes or our environment that shapes who we are?
Honestly, it's both. And it's not even like a simple 50-50 split. It's this super complex interplay between the two.
Okay, so it's not either, it's both hand.
All right, so think about it like this. Your genes, your DNA, that's like the blueprint for your potential. But your environment, everything from your family and your culture to your experiences and even random events, That's what shapes how that blueprint is actually expressed.
So it's like we're all born with certain predispositions, but our environment can either nurture or hinder those predispositions.
Exactly. And the book introduces this concept of maturation.
Maturation,
Yeah.
like ripening like a banana?
Well, sort of. It's like this inner biological clock that guides our development. But the thing is, that clock can run a little faster or slower for different people, and the environment can also influence its timing.
So, like, we're all programmed to walk and talk eventually, but some kids hit those milestones earlier or later than others.
Right, and that's where context comes in. Ever wonder why some people seem to thrive in challenging situations while others struggle? It's not just about their inner strength. It's also about the context surrounding them.
Ah, context, like the environment they're in.
Exactly. So let's dive into some of those contextual factors, starting with the most fundamental one, family.
Okay, so the textbook, what does it say about the role of family in shaping who we are?
Well, family is our first world, right? It's where we learn about love, trust, relationships. It's also where we first learn how to deal with conflict and navigate social situations.
It's like our training ground for life.
Exactly. And the book points out that families today are way more diverse than like the Leave It to Beaver ideal we see on old TV shows.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Single parent families, blended families, same sex couples raising kids, multi generational households. The landscape has definitely changed. And I'm guessing all of these different family structures impact development in unique ways.
Absolutely. Each family structure comes with its own set of strengths and challenges. And those can impact everything from a child's sense of security and belonging to their academic achievements and social
It
skills.
makes you realize that there's no one size fits all blueprint for family.
Right. There are so many ways to be a family, and researchers are still trying to understand how these different dynamics play out in kids' lives.
Okay, so family structure is one piece of the puzzle. But what about the resources and opportunities a family has access to? That must play a huge role too.
You're hitting on a crucial point. Socioeconomic status, or SES, has a massive impact on development. It affects a family's access to things like quality education, healthcare, safe neighborhoods, even healthy food options.
Yeah, like a child growing up in poverty is going to face a whole different set of challenges than a child from a wealthy family.
Absolutely. Those challenges can create what researchers call risk factors, conditions that can increase the likelihood of negative outcomes. But it's important to remember that negative effects aren't inevitable.
So, like, just because a child grows up in poverty doesn't mean they're destined for a difficult life.
Exactly. Supportive relationships, strong communities, and individual resilience can make a world of difference.
It's like poverty creates obstacles, but it doesn't determine destiny.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for researchers to study the impact of poverty and to advocate for policies and programs that support families and level the playing field.
I agree. So, we've talked about family structure and socioeconomic status, but there's an even bigger context beyond our immediate surroundings, right? Like the culture we grew up in.
You got it. Culture is like the air we breathe. We
Hmm.
don't always notice it, but it's constantly shaping our values, our beliefs, our behaviors, even how we think and learn. And here in the U.S., we have a melting pot of different cultures.
Right. And that diversity is one of the things that makes this country so unique and dynamic.
It really is. But it also presents some interesting challenges for individuals and families navigating different cultural norms and expectations.
Like, how do you raise a child with values from one culture when they're living in a society that promotes different values?
Exactly. It could be a complex balancing act, and researchers are still trying to figure out how those dynamics play out in development.
So we've got family, SES, and culture all shaping who we are. Are there any other big picture influences?
Well, we can't forget about history.
History, like what happened in the past, can influence how we develop today.
Absolutely. Think about it. The generation that grew up during World War II had a vastly different experience than millennials growing up in the digital age.
Totally. It's like our place in history shapes our worldview, our opportunities, even our fears and anxieties.
Exactly. The book calls these normative, history-graded influences. They're the big, sweeping events that affect everyone in a certain generation.
It makes you realize that development isn't just about individual experiences, it's also about our shared history.
Precisely. And these historical events interact with all those other factors we've been talking about, family, SES, culture, to create this incredibly complex tapestry of influences.
Wow, it's kind of mind-boggling when you start to think about all these different layers shaping who we are.
It is. But there's more. What about the unpredictable stuff in life, the unexpected twists and turns that we all face?
Okay, like what?
Things like a serious illness, the death of a loved one, a job loss, even winning the lottery. These are what the book calls non-normative influences. They're the unique, often unexpected events that can disrupt those typical developmental pathways.
Yeah, it's like we're all on this developmental journey, but the road isn't always smooth.
Exactly. There are bumps, detours, and unexpected forks in the road. And these non-normative events can have a huge impact on how we develop, for better or for worse.
It's like some events are shared by a whole generation, while others are totally unique to our own personal journey.
Right. And that's what makes human development so fascinating. It's this complex interplay between the predictable and the unpredictable.
So if we're all shaped by this intricate web of influences, is there ever a point where it's too late to change or learn something new? Like, do we miss our chance to develop certain skills or traits if we don't get them early on?
It's not really about closed doors, but more like windows of opportunity.
Hmm.
You've probably heard of imprinting, right? Like those cute baby ducks that follow the first thing they see after hatching.
Oh, yeah, like they think that thing is their mom.
Exactly. Well, humans are obviously more complex than ducklings, but there are certain periods in our development when we're especially primed for learning certain things.
So, like, there are ideal times for picking up new skills or knowledge.
Right. The book talks a lot about language development.
Yeah.
While the jury's still out on whether there's a hard deadline for language learning, it's clear that kids who are exposed to language early on tend to pick it up more effortlessly.
So those early years are like a sensitive period for language development, but it doesn't mean you can't learn a new language as an adult.
Exactly. It just might take a little more effort.
Okay, so we've got these windows of opportunity, but they don't slam shut completely if we miss them. There's still hope for us late bloomers.
Definitely. Our brains are amazingly adaptable. We have what's called plasticity, which means we can continue to learn and grow throughout our lives.
That's good to know. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground. The different domains of development, the nature-nurture interplay, the importance of context, these sensitive periods. But how does it all fit together? Like, is there a big picture framework for understanding human development across the lifespan?
There is. It's called the lifespan developmental approach. A guy named Paul Boltz, he kind of laid out the groundwork for this perspective.
Okay, hit me with the SparkNotes version. What are the key takeaways from Boltz's approach?
All right, well, he argued that development is lifelong, multidimensional, and multidirectional. Those are kind of the big three.
Okay, I think I get lifelong. That means development doesn't just stop when you hit a certain age. We're always changing and adapting.
Exactly. And multidimensional, well, that goes back to those three areas we talked about earlier, physical, cognitive, and psychosocial. We're not developing in just one area at a time. It's all happening simultaneously.
Right, like we're this complex mix of all those dimensions, and they're all interacting and influencing each other.
Precisely. And then there's multidirectional.
That one sounds a bit trickier. What does that mean exactly?
Well, it means development isn't always about gaining new skills or knowledge. Sometimes it's about losing certain abilities as we age. Or maybe we shift our focus and priorities, pouring more energy into some areas while letting go of others.
So it's not always a straight line toward progress. There are peaks and valleys along the way.
Exactly. And that's totally normal.
Okay, so that's the big three. What are the other four principles?
Well, Baltz also argued that the balance between biology and culture shifts as we age. Early on, our genes, our biology plays a huge role. But as we get older, our experiences and the culture we live in become increasingly important.
So it's like nature lays the foundation, but nurture builds the house.
Exactly. And then there's this idea that development involves changing resource allocation.
Okay, that one sounds a bit abstract. What does it mean?
Well, we all have a limited amount of time, energy, and resources, right?
Like our personal budget for life.
Exactly. And how we choose to spend that budget changes over time.
Okay, so, like when we're young, we might invest most of our resources in learning new things, but as we get older, we might shift those resources toward maintaining our health or nurturing relationships.
Right. And that leads us to Baltz's next principle, plasticity. He emphasized that our brains are amazingly adaptable, and that plasticity allows us to keep learning and growing throughout our lives.
So even if we miss some of those windows of opportunity earlier on, we can still develop new skills and knowledge later in life.
Exactly. It might just take a bit more effort and intentionality. And finally, Baltz emphasized that development is always influenced by the historical and cultural context we live in.
like we were saying before, where and when we grow up makes a big difference.
Absolutely. It shapes our values, our opportunities, even our understanding of what it means to be human.
Okay, so to sum it all up, human development is this incredibly complex process influenced by a whole bunch of factors: our genes, our environment, our experiences, and even the time period we live in.
Exactly. It's like this giant equation with all these different variables interacting and influencing each other.
Wow, that's a lot to take in.
It is, but it's also pretty fascinating, right?
It really is. It gives you a whole new perspective on yourself and the people around you.
I think so too.
So we've covered the what of human development, but how do researchers actually study all of this? Like, what methods do they use to unravel these mysteries? That's what we'll be tackling in the next part of our deep dive, so stay tuned. Welcome back to our deep dive into human development.
I'm excited to keep going.
Me too. So we've laid this groundwork for understanding what human development is, but now I'm really curious about how researchers actually study this complex process.
That's a great question. It's one thing to talk about these concepts, but how do we go from like these abstract ideas to actual data and insights?
Right, like how do we actually know what we know about how humans develop?
Exactly. And that's what this chapter dives into, the methods and tools that researchers use to explore the hows and whys of human development. It can get pretty technical, but it's fascinating stuff.
Okay, I'm ready to geek out a little. So the book mentions something called research designs. What are those exactly?
Think of a research design as a blueprint for a study. Just like you wouldn't build a house without a plan, researchers need a roadmap to guide their investigation.
Okay, so it's like a set of instructions for how to conduct the research.
Exactly. And just like there are different types of houses, there are different types of research designs. The best design depends on the specific question you're asking and the type of information you're hoping to gather.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Not at all. There's a whole toolbox of different research designs, each with its own strengths and weaknesses.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Can you give me a taste of some of those research designs? Like, what are some of the tools in that toolbox?
Well, imagine you're a detective trying to solve a really complex case. You might start by interviewing witnesses, gathering evidence, and piecing together a timeline.
Like following the clues to see where they lead.
Exactly. And that's kind of what a case study does in the world of human development. It's an in-depth exploration of a single individual or maybe a small group.
So like a deep dive into one person's life and experiences.
Precisely. Researchers gather tons of information from various sources, interviews, observations, maybe even diaries or school records, to create a really rich, detailed portrait of the individual's development.
Okay, so it's like a biography, but with a scientific focus.
Exactly. And case studies are particularly useful for studying rare phenomena or those unique experiences that don't fit neatly into a larger study.
I can see how that would be helpful, like if you're trying to understand a rare medical condition or the impact of a traumatic event.
Right. They can be really powerful for generating hypotheses and exploring possible explanations for things that we don't fully understand.
But I'm guessing there are limitations too. Like if you're only studying one person, can you really apply what you learn to a larger population?
That's a great point. Case studies are not great for making broad generalizations. They're more about diving deep into the specifics of a particular case.
Okay, so case studies are about depth, not breadth.
Exactly. They're about understanding the nuances of a particular individual's experience.
That makes sense. So what about those ethnographic studies the book mentioned? Those sound a bit more, I don't know, adventurous.
They can be. Imagine an anthropologist living with a remote tribe in the Amazon rainforest, immersing themselves in the culture to understand their way of life.
Okay, so it's like going undercover to study human behavior.
Well, sort of. It's not about being sneaky. It's about really immersing yourself in a different culture to understand the values, beliefs, and practices that shape development in that particular context.
So you're not just observing from a distance, you're actually participating in their daily lives.
Exactly. Researchers conducting ethnographic studies might live with a community for months or even years, observing rituals, participating in activities, and conducting interviews to gain a deeper understanding of their way of life.
Wow, that sounds like it could be really challenging, but also incredibly rewarding.
It is, and it's essential for challenging our own cultural biases and recognizing that there are many different ways of being human.
Right, because so much of the research in psychology and human development has been focused on Western industrialized societies. It's important to see how things might be different in other parts of the world.
Absolutely. But it's important to note that ethnographic studies, like all research methods, have their limitations. Because researchers are so deeply immersed in the culture they're studying, Their interpretations can be influenced by their own perspectives and experiences.
So it's like you're trying to see the world through their eyes, but you can't completely escape your own cultural lens.
Exactly. And being aware of those potential biases is crucial for interpreting the findings of ethnographic research.
Okay, that makes sense. So we've covered case studies and ethnographic studies. What about correlational studies? The book talked about those as a way to examine the relationships between variables.
Think of it like plotting data points on a graph. A correlational study is about looking for patterns in those data points. Do they cluster together or do they spread out in a particular way?
Okay, I'm a visual learner, so I'm getting that. Give me a real-world example.
Sure. Imagine a study that finds a positive correlation between the amount of time kids spend reading and their vocabulary size.
So kids who read more tend to have bigger vocabularies.
Exactly. But here's the catch. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Just because two things are related doesn't mean that one causes the other.
The classic correlation doesn't equal causation dilemma. I've heard that before.
It's an important one to remember. In that reading example, it could be that kids who are naturally curious and enjoy learning are more likely to both read more and have bigger vocabularies.
So it's not necessarily the reading that's causing the vocabulary growth. It could be some other underlying factor.
Precisely.
Yeah.
But even though correlational studies can't tell us for sure what causes what, they're still really valuable for identifying potential relationships and generating hypotheses for future research.
Okay, so correlations are like clues, but they don't solve the whole mystery.
Exactly. To get to those causal relationships, we need to move beyond correlations and into the world of experiments.
Okay, experiments. Those are the gold standard for figuring out what causes what, right?
You got it. In an experiment, researchers deliberately manipulate one variable to see how it affects another variable. It's about controlling the situation as much as possible to isolate those cause and effect relationships.
Okay, give me an example.
Let's say we want to study whether playing Mozart to babies actually makes them smarter, like some people claim.
I've heard that one. But how would you test it experimentally?
Well, you could randomly assign a group of babies to either listen to Mozart for a certain amount of time each day, or to listen to, say, white noise or some other type of music. And then, after a certain period, you could measure their cognitive development using some standardized tests.
So you're comparing the Mozart group to a control group to see if there's a difference in their cognitive development.
Exactly. And the key here is that the babies are randomly assigned to each group. That way you're minimizing the chances that any pre-existing differences between the babies are skewing the results.
Makes sense. So if the Mozart group ends up scoring significantly higher on those cognitive tests, then you can be more confident that it was actually the Mozart that made the difference.
Right. And that's the beauty of experiments. When they're designed well, they allow us to make causal inferences to say that one variable actually caused a change in another variable.
Okay, so experiments are all about control and manipulation, but do they always have to happen in a lab setting?
Not necessarily. While lab experiments offer a lot of control over the environment, they can sometimes feel a bit artificial. And that's where field experiments come in.
Field experiments. So like taking the experiment out of the lab and into the real world.
Exactly. Let's say you're interested in studying whether a new type of playground equipment encourages more physical activity in kids. You could set up your experiment at an actual playground, randomly assigning kids to either use the new equipment or the old equipment, and then observing their activity levels.
So you're still manipulating a variable and controlling the situation as much as possible, but you're doing it in a more natural setting.
Right. And that can sometimes give you more realistic and ecologically valid results.
So it's a trade-off, more control in the lab versus more realism in the field.
Exactly. Researchers have to weigh those pros and cons when deciding which type of experiment is best for the research question.
Okay, so we've got lab experiments and field experiments. Are there any other types?
There's one more type that's worth mentioning. Natural experiments. These aren't true experiments in the sense that researchers don't actually manipulate any variables. Instead, they take advantage of naturally occurring events to study their effects on development.
Okay, like what kind of naturally occurring events?
Imagine a study that compares the development of children who were adopted internationally versus those who were adopted domestically.
So the researchers aren't controlling who gets adopted or where they come from, but they can observe those natural differences and look for patterns.
Exactly. Or another example could be studying the long-term effects of a natural disaster on children's mental health.
Oh, right. You can't exactly create a natural disaster for the sake of research.
Definitely not. But these natural experiments, even though they're not true experiments, can still provide valuable insights into how real-world events impact development.
So it's like nature is running the experiment for us.
Exactly. And researchers are there to observe and analyze the results.
Okay, so we've got a whole spectrum of experiments, from those highly controlled lab studies to those observing real-world events.
It's all about choosing the best tool for the job.
Makes sense. But the book also talked about developmental research designs. What sets those apart from the other designs?
Developmental research designs are specifically designed to study change over time. They're all about capturing that dynamic process of development, how people grow and change as they age.
Okay, so they're like time-lapse videos of human development.
Exactly. And there are two main types: cross-sectional and longitudinal studies. A cross-sectional study is like taking a snapshot of different age groups at a single point in time.
So, like, if you wanted to study how memory changes with age, you could gather a group of 20-year-olds, 40-year-olds, and 60-year-olds and give them all a memory test on the same day.
Precisely. And then you can compare their performance to see if there are any age-related differences.
Sounds efficient. What are the downsides?
The main drawback is that you can't be sure if those differences are truly due to age or if they reflect something unique about those particular groups of people. Maybe the 60-year-olds just happen to be a really sharp bunch.
Right, so it's like comparing apples and oranges. You're not really tracking the same individuals over time, so you can't be sure what's causing the differences.
Exactly. And that's where longitudinal studies come in.
Okay, tell me about those.
Instead of comparing different age groups at one point in time, a longitudinal study follows the same individuals over a longer period, measuring them at multiple points along the way. So you're essentially creating a developmental movie, not just a snapshot.
I like that analogy. So for that memory study, you'd follow the same group of people from, say, age 20 to 60, giving them memory tests every few years.
Exactly. And that way you can see how their memory actually changes over time, and you can control for those individual differences that might be confounding the results in a cross-sectional study.
So longitudinal studies give you a much richer, more detailed picture of development, but I'm guessing there are downsides too.
There are. Longitudinal studies are incredibly time-consuming and expensive, and there's always the risk of people dropping out of the study, which can skew the results. But they're the gold standard for understanding how individuals change over time.
So cross-sectional studies are quicker and easier, but longitudinal studies give you a more accurate and nuanced perspective.
Right. It's all about choosing the best approach for the research question.
Okay, so we've got cross-sectional studies, longitudinal studies. Is there a way to get the best of both worlds?
There is. It's called a sequential study.
Sequential study. What's that?
It's basically a hybrid approach that combines elements of both cross-sectional and longitudinal designs.
Okay, how does that work?
Imagine you start with 2 or more age groups, like in a cross-sectional study, but then you follow those groups over time, like in a longitudinal study.
So it's like you're getting a broader view of age differences and you're tracking individual changes over time.
Exactly. Sequential designs are really powerful for unraveling the complex interplay of age, cohort, and historical influences on development.
That's pretty impressive, but I can only imagine how complex those studies must be to design and analyze.
They are, but they can provide some incredibly valuable insights. And speaking of valuable insights, we can't wrap up our discussion of research methods without talking about ethics.
Oh, right, because we can't just go around studying people without considering their well-being.
Exactly. Ethical considerations are paramount in human development research, especially when we're working with vulnerable populations like children.
Because kids can't always advocate for themselves, and they're still developing, so we need to be extra careful.
Absolutely. And that's what we'll be exploring in the next part of our deep dive. We'll delve into the ethical guidelines that protect research participants and ensure that research is conducted responsibly and ethically.
Welcome back to our deep dive.
Part 3.
Part 3. I feel like we've covered so much already.
We have.
But I'm also realizing that we haven't even touched on the ethics of all of this research, you know? Like, are there rules researchers have to follow when they're studying people?
Oh, that's a great point. Absolutely. I mean, we can't just go around experimenting on people willy-nilly, right?
Yeah, there have to be some safeguards in place, especially when we're talking about kids who are still developing and might not always understand what they're getting into.
Right, exactly. And that's what this last chapter is all about. The ethical considerations that guide research in human development.
Okay, so what are some of those ethical guidelines? Like, what are the big no-nos in research?
Well, imagine you're a doctor, right? You wouldn't just start treating a patient without explaining the risks and benefits and getting their consent.
Of course not.
Right. Well, the same principle applies to research, even if the treatment is participating in a study. Researchers had to get something called informed consent from their participants.
Okay, so informed consent is like getting permission before you start collecting data or doing any experiments.
Exactly. It means participants need to understand what the research is about, what they'll be asked to do, and any potential risks or benefits involved. And they need to know that they're free to withdraw from the study at any time without penalty.
It's like you can't trick people into participating or make them feel pressured.
Exactly. It's all about respecting their autonomy and their right to make informed decisions about their own involvement.
Okay, that makes sense. But what about kids? I mean, they can't always fully understand the complexities of research, so how does informed consent work when you're studying children?
That's a really good question. And it's one that researchers have to grapple with all the time. The general rule is that when you're working with kids, you need to get consent from both the child and their parents or guardians.
So it's like a double layer of protection.
Right, and it's not just about getting signatures on a form. Researchers have to take the time to explain the study to the child in age-appropriate language, making sure they understand what's going on and that they have the right to say no at any time.
It's like you can't just assume that kids are okay with whatever their parents agree to.
Exactly. Kids need to be active participants in the consent process, even if they're not the ones signing on the dotted line.
Okay, so we've got informed consent. What other ethical considerations are there?
Well, there's this idea of beneficence, which basically means that researchers have an obligation to maximize the benefits of their research while minimizing any potential harm to participants.
So it's like a balancing act.
Exactly. You're always weighing the potential gains in knowledge against the potential risks to the people involved.
It's not just about getting the data, it's about getting it responsibly.
Right. And another core principle is justice, which is all about fairness in research. It means making sure that the benefits and burdens of research are distributed fairly across different groups in society.
So, like, you wouldn't want to only study a new drug on prisoners or low-income communities just because they're more accessible.
Exactly. That would be a huge ethical violation. Justice is about making sure that everyone has an equal opportunity to benefit from research and that no one is unfairly burdened by it.
Okay, so we've got informed consent, beneficence, and justice. But I'm guessing things aren't always so clear-cut in the real world.
You're absolutely right. Researchers often face ethical dilemmas where there's no easy answer.
Like what?
Well, let's say you're studying a new therapy for children with a serious illness. You believe this therapy could be really beneficial, but there are also some potential side effects. How do you balance the potential benefits for these kids with the risks they might face by participating in the study?
That's a tough one.
It is. And that's why research institutions have something called institutional review boards, or IRBs.
Or IRBs.
They're basically committees made up of experts from various fields who review research proposals to make sure they meet ethical standards.
So they're like the ethics police of the research world.
Kind of, yeah. They make sure that the research is well designed, that the risks to participants are minimized, and that the potential benefits outweigh those risks.
Okay, that makes me feel a bit better knowing that there's this extra layer of scrutiny.
It's an important safeguard. And it's not just about checking boxes. It's about really thinking through the ethical implications of the research and making sure that everything is being done to protect the well-being of the participants.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored the basic building blocks of human development, the methods that researchers use to study this complex process, and the ethical guidelines that keep everything in check. It's been a fascinating journey.
It really has.
Yeah.
And I think it highlights just how complex and amazing human development truly is. The fact that we start out as these tiny, helpless beings and somehow transform into these complex individuals with unique thoughts, feelings, and abilities is just mind-boggling.
And this is just the tip of the iceberg, right?
Oh, absolutely. There's so much more to learn and explore. And the more we understand about human development, the better equipped we'll be to support individuals and create a world where everyone has the opportunity to thrive.
Well said. Big thanks to you for joining me on this deep dive. It's been an enlightening conversation.
Thanks for having me.
And to all of our listeners, keep those brains firing, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.